Beginning January 1st of 2026, so a little over a year from now, any product that carries the made in the USA or product of the USA label is going to have to come from animals that were born, raised, and processed in the United States. Right now, if Isoween is born here in Canada and it goes to Iowa to be fed and processed, it can be sold to Costco and labeled as a product of the USA when it goes onto the shelf. And in fact, that's what Costco does. But as of January 1st, 2026, that Canadian Isoween will no longer be eligible for that market stream.
Welcome to the Swine at Canada podcast. I am Dan Columbus, and I'll be your host for this episode. And we have a returning guest today, somebody who's been on the show before, Cam Dahl, who's General Manager of Manitoba Pork. So welcome back.
It's really good to be with you, Dan.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this conversation because I think this is something that is very or has a lot of implications for the market. But before we get into that, just because it's been a while, we'll have you introduce yourself again and kind of let everybody know who you are.
For sure. I'm Cam Dahl and have been the general manager with Manitoba Pork for about 3.5 years. I've had experience in the grain sector, have been a commissioner of the Canadian Grain Commission. Also had worked in Ottawa for almost 10 years and have worked in the beef sector as well. So I almost have a full plate of food. Not quite, but almost.
Definitely not going hungry with that one. So the topic today is really going to be all around the North American market and the integration of that market and how we can make that better. Specifically, I think, and this is something that you've been kind of writing a little bit about and getting out there, is this new origin of labeling and other legislation that's been coming up that's kind of maybe not helping us with this integration. So maybe let's just start with what's the state of everything right now, and then we'll go from there.
Well, we're kind of moving in the wrong direction, and that is something that is of concern for every export-oriented industry. And in Manitoba here, we export about 90% of the 8 million pigs we raise every year, either as live animals into the United States or as in packages around the world. And so ensuring that we have that international access is critically important. And it's especially important in the United States. And we're seeing movement in the wrong direction when it comes to access. And really, getting away from that idea of a really integrated North American market. And country of origin labeling is one of those examples. Canada and Mexico fought mandatory country of origin labeling at the WTO a number of years ago, and we won that case. But cool is back, and it's back this time being labeled, if you pardon the pun, as voluntary, but it's really not. So beginning January 1st of 2026, so a little over a year from now, any product that carries the made in the USA or product of the USA label is going to have to come from animals that were born, raised, and processed in the United States. Right now, if Isoween is born here in Canada and it goes to Iowa to be fed and processed, it can be sold to Costco and labeled as a product of the USA when it goes onto the shelf. And in fact, that's what Costco does. But as of January 1st, 2026, that Canadian Isoween will no longer be eligible for that market stream. And so, naturally, it's going to be worth less. And we're going to see a discount on Canadian pigs moving into the United States. And again, that's going to hurt consumers. It's going to hurt farmers. it's really not going to benefit anybody at all. It's just going to introduce more cost and segregation into the system. So that's one example of where we're moving in the wrong direction. Of course, we've talked about Proposition 12 before, but there again, that's a single state that is reaching outside of their borders, passing regulation and legislation to reach outside their borders to impose conditions on, how pigs are raised here in Canada. And we signed a trade agreement with the United States of America. It's not very united at this point. We can't afford to have producing for 50 different states and having 50 different conditions on our trade. Again, it's just going to introduce more cost, and it's going to make it more expensive to raise animals, and consumers will be hurt. At this time of rising food prices and inflation, consumers on both sides of the border are going to be hurt. So we need to be looking for ways of reducing regulatory barriers, not increasing them.
Swine Veterinary Partners offers a full range of animal health and production services to Canadian pork producers. We approach health management through personalized solution with concern for profitability while taking into account performance and the well-being of your animals.
Yeah, I mean, even other states kind of took that Proposition 12 to the Supreme Court and kind of said, how can one state do this to us, right? So the fact that it's was kind of negatively viewed everywhere except for maybe California and maybe some of the other ones that are putting it in.
Well, there's others, and Massachusetts is another example, and there's 12 states are now taking Massachusetts to court over their law because they're going even further than California. So California's law says that if you don't raise pigs how we like it, you can't sell the pork in California. Well, Massachusetts is going further and saying if you don't raise pigs how we like it, and of course their definition of like is different than California. If you don't raise pigs how we like it, we're not even going to allow you to take a truck across Massachusetts. And again, so it's fragmenting that North American market, introducing cost, introducing regulation where it's not needed.
Yeah. So one of the big things with the new country of origin labeling is that it's voluntary, right? You're saying that that's still going to be discriminatory. I guess maybe delve a little bit more into that.
Sure.
Like why is a voluntary, labeling? I don't want to say requirement, but why is that still going to be negative?
Sure, and the argument is, well, people don't have to put the product of the USA label on their sausages or their pork products or, frankly, their beef products, any other red meat. You don't have to use the label, and that's true. But we do have major retailers that use that label, and I gave the example of Costco. If you go into the Costco here in Winnipeg or anywhere across Canada and look at their products, most of them carry the product of the USA label. And they're not likely to change that on January 1st, 2026. And so you have that major retailer that is, not going to be, are going to be telling their suppliers that they don't want any Canadian origin pigs, and we're already hearing from some processors that are indicating. Seaboard Triumph is an example that are indicating that they are not going to be taking any Canadian origin pigs, and we're also hearing that some other major processors are telling their buyers that don't sign any contracts with Canadian origin pigs. So we're already seeing evidence of that kind of discrimination. And then the other big sort of elephant in the room is, of course, the largest purchaser of food in the U.S. is the government of the United States. And the government of the United States is going to follow the conditions of that product of USA labeling. So you have major retailers that are going to be following that, and you have the largest purchaser of food in the U.S. going to be following that. It is going to result in discrimination.
Yeah, so I mean that makes it very clear from Canada's perspective. I think the other side of it is this is not necessarily positive for US producers either, right? There's a reason 90% of Manitoba's live pigs are exported to the US, right? So what are the impacts that they're going to see?
Well, it is going to have an impact, and yeah, we ship just from Manitoba 3 million isoweens into the U.S. every year, and so there is a major part of the U.S. Industry that is going to have their supply interrupted, is going to have their cost increase. So again, we're looking at a regulatory burden that is simply going to result in increased cost for producers on both sides of the border, and that's ultimately going to result in increased costs for consumers. So it's bad policy.
So I guess the question is then what do we do about this? And in the one article that I've seen recently that come out, you talk about this Team Canada and the missions with Kuzma, right? And how agriculture is not in there. So maybe, I mean, obviously the government is going to be one side of this, but in general, what can be done?
So there are some things that we did back in when we were fighting the original country of origin labeling law, and one of those was we published a list of products that we would put tariffs on, that we would retaliate on, as the WTO had allowed. In the event that the U.S. Didn't change their legislation. It was a very effective tool in pointing out that there is going to be impact on some specific businesses in the U.S. and that really helped motivate folks on the U.S. side of the border to advocate for regulation that didn't impact the North American market. So that's one thing we could do. Right now, I think there are other tools we could, for example, develop a North American label. If the concern is that you have meat products coming from countries outside of North America, well, why don't we have a product of North America label? Again, that integrates that North American market and that would actually help support our North American market rather than break it apart. So there are some ways that we could be addressing this. Some of it being a little bit more of aggressive stance from the government of Canada, and there are positive ways that we could look at putting labels on food that support North American producers rather than hurt them.
Yeah. So you mentioned that, things like the tariffs and that were done before and kind of, response to the original cool. I'm thinking right now, though, right, where we just had this issue with the EVs in China, and then the retaliatory method on canola. Do you think maybe this is a loaded question, do you think there's an appetite in Ottawa for doing this, or?
Well, we're not seeing enough of an appetite. I'll be blunt about it. We need to have a stronger defense of Canadian interests. And you raise a really good point with the EV situation, because it points to this rise of protectionism around the world, and we are seeing that. Again, to be blunt about it, I'm concerned that as this trade issue between Canada and China continues, that pork is going to become a target. And so instead of making it more difficult to trade within North America, we should be making it easier. We should be supporting call it our local market, rather than breaking it apart. So yes, I'm looking for a stronger defense, and as I said, what's happening in the rest of the world just demonstrates so much why we need to have, ensure that this North American market is as seamless as possible.
Yeah. So I think in the second half of this episode, and kind of along the same lines of trying to make things easier and not more difficult, one of the other things that you've talked about recently is the regulatory system within Canada and bringing in new technologies and specifically, like say, new additives and feed products and stuff like that, and how onerous it is. This is a topic that's come up at multiple conferences and stuff like that too, I've seen recently, right? And so maybe just discuss that a little bit.
Well, it's in the introduction, I noted I've worked and involved in other sectors of agriculture as well, and this issue is an issue for grain producers. The regulation around farm inputs and chemicals. It's an issue for the beef industry. This is an issue across the board where products can be registered in the U.S. And our competitors there have access to new innovation. Again, whether that's veterinary drugs, new veterinary drugs, or additives, and it's so difficult to go through the entire process here in Canada that quite often companies don't even bother. They don't even bother to start the regulatory system or start going through the regulatory system here in Canada. And it means that we're less competitive in agriculture in general here in Canada than we could be. And it doesn't have to be that way. We can trust a large part of what the U.S. process is. If there's research done on a new additive and the company has gone through the entire process of trials and research, and they've presented this data package to the Federal Drug Administration in the U.S. for approval, well, we don't need to go through that whole process again. We really don't. We can take that data package that has been presented to the FDA and introduce that into the Canadian regulatory system and say, does this work for us? And again, that looking at integrating that North American market and reducing barriers to that cross-border interaction. It shouldn't be that difficult to do, and in no way would safety of Canadians be impacted. So there is a step that can reduce costs. Again, governments talk. We've talked about food inflation. Governments talk about ways to address food inflation and rising costs. Well, let's make it easier to have these efficiencies introduced into the production system.
Yeah, it's, you mentioned like FDA approval or whatever it is down in the US, but even across agencies within Canada, you could see that there should be more communication where, if something is approved by Health Canada, why can it not just be then approved? We say all the time, it's like, I can't feed certain amino acids to my pigs in my studies because they're not on the list for CFIA, but I can walk to my local supplement store and buy a jug of leucine.
Yeah, absolutely.
And take as much of it as I want. So it's like, how does this make sense?
It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And again, these are not revolutionary steps. They're things that the government could be doing today, and we even have the systems in place to address some of these issues. When the first Canada-U.S. trade deal was signed, we established something called the Regulatory Cooperation Council. And the council's job is to find these impediments to cross-border trade and impediments to innovation and eliminate them. And so we have the tools in place to correct some of these issues. We should be using them.
Well, hopefully the right people are listening to this episode and can do something. Yeah, I know. I personally was hoping that there was going to be something in the new feed regulations that came out that kind of addressed this issue, but alas, not really.
Not really. And we waited 30 years for that? It's not quite, but for the amendments to the feed regulations.
Yeah, no, unfortunately not. Okay, well, I think that's been a great discussion. I'll just ask, for a final take home before we get to our 3 questions, which I'm going to ask you again because it's been a while and so they might have changed.
The take home is we're facing trade headwinds around the world. Protectionism is on the rise. We should be looking for ways of making it easier to trade locally, and by locally I mean within North America. And instead, we're going in the opposite direction. This is something that our governments need to really take seriously and address, and ensure that it is as easy as possible to move product and people across our borders.
Yeah, great. Okay, so our 3 questions. Maybe I have different answers this time. We'll see.
It's time for our famous 3.
What is your favorite swine-related resource?
So you know what? I read the Canadian Hog Journal. I think it's great. So yeah, that's. I was sorry to hear that Andrew Heck had left, and concerned that we wouldn't see it anymore. But my understanding is it's going to continue. So that's a good thing.
Yeah, I read that one too. So hopefully it does. And then our next question is a favorite book outside of swine. So maybe you have a new book recommendation.
Well, I'm going to give you a different, and this one may be off the beaten path. There's a former journalist and columnist with the Western Producer called Barry Wilson, and Mr. Wilson is a bit of a history buff, and he's written a few historical biographies, but one of those was on Sir Mackenzie Bowell, the forgotten, or the Prime Minister that Canada has forgotten. And it's a good read, and for anyone interested in politics, I would recommend Barry's book on Sir Mackenzie Bowell, one of our forgotten prime ministers. But you'll learn everything about the Manitoba school crisis too, if you're interested.
Very interesting. So, and then our last one is what is a characteristic that you think that successful leaders or pork producers or something have? Maybe you had a tie in this one the last time. You didn't know which one to pick, so now you can give the other one.
Well, there's a few on the list. One of those is adaptability, and we've talked about changes in the market and instability around the world for a whole host of reasons, and being able to adapt to changing conditions, I think is probably one of the most critical traits.
Yeah. I'd say that's across the whole pork value chain. If you can't adapt, you're going to struggle. So
I 100% agree.
Really good. Well, Kev, it's been great having you back on. I always enjoy our conversations. So thanks once again for joining us.
Me as well, Dan. Thanks.